I don't think that Russia will survive in that regime for more than, say, 20 or something, 25 years. Even as much as the Soviet Union was powerful ideologically in terms of controlling like half of the world, basically, half of Europe, it still existed for 70 odd years. Russia is not going to be destroyed from outside. It has to be that political system needs to be destroyed from inside. So yes, we see very much, I would say, the division of the West, what Putin wanted. Like always, he talked about the new security architecture of Europe since the beginning of his presidency. And that's in many respects it's happening. I mean, there are voices in the United States who want to withdraw from NATO.
Christmas did not bring a ceasefire. Russia keeps striking Ukrainian cities and then blames everyone else for the war. Ukraine itself and now Europe too. Meanwhile, the world is changing fast. And 2025 has felt like a year of irreversible shifts in power, alliances, and the rules of war. To talk about what really defined 2025 and what it means for 2026, I'm joined by Professor Peter Eltsov, historian and expert on international security affairs at the National Defense University. Peter, it's my pleasure to have you here online. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Nataliia. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure for me as well.
So, Peter, let's start with the latest. Putin says Kyiv is not rushing toward peace and warns that Russia will achieve its goals by force. This came right after a major Russian strike just before the Zelenskyy Trump meeting in Miami. Are Ukrainians being told to expect another year of terror until they give up and give in?
Well, I don't like to give very exact predictions because sometimes I was wrong. But I think, yes, in this case, Putin does not want to stop the war. It seems like, to me, it seems very unlikely that he would agree for any ceasefire when he hasn't taken actually any major Ukrainian city. Even Kharkiv, which is only like less than 100 kilometers from the Russian border, is still under the control of the Ukrainian army. So if this happens, if he actually agrees for some ceasefire, I would suspect that he could easily start a war, renew attacks, say, half a year later or a year later. And even actually there was an interview recently in one of the big Russian talk shows with this scholar Karaganov. And he is a horrible warmonger. He keeps saying that Russia should use nuclear weapons to scare Europe, basically start a war with Europe. And he openly said, if Putin agrees for some kind of a ceasefire, we just need some rest so we can go back to war again. So I honestly don't believe him. I don't believe in good intentions that he, even if Zelenskyy and the Ukrainian government were to agree to give up on the Donbass, what they want right now for the remaining parts of the Donbass, which are still under the control of the Ukrainian army, I really doubt that this will satisfy his demands. Because if you listen to the people in his circle, they want maybe if not the entire Ukraine, but at least Ukraine east of the Dnieper River.
So they're all infected by this imperialism.
Yes, I would say yes. And the biggest delusion in the West among some people, and unfortunately today also in the government, that they don't realize very often how many people support Putin in reality in Russia, how many high-level political figures support him, and also what the real intention in Ukraine are, what the real intentions of Putin and his base are. And I think it's not just Donbass or Luhansk or this or eastern areas. It's much more. And of course, he just recently suggested, which sounds completely absurd during the war. So the talk now I know in Ukraine is that potentially there will be new presidential elections. But Putin now says that those Ukrainians who live in Russia now, and he estimates them 5 to 10 million people. I think this is a grossly exaggerated number, that they should be allowed in those Ukrainian allowed to vote in those elections. This is absurd for many reasons. First of all, they live in Russia in an authoritarian state, and if they even left Ukraine, so most likely they are on the Russian side. So, I mean, this, of course, adds all this political complexity.
Yeah, I have my personal opinion about elections, but I mean, I'm not the one who's deciding here. So maybe because I've been to the off-the-record interview, which then become publicly with the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy, and he said if that would be necessary, the election will happen in Ukraine, but a lot of experts saying that's a huge mistake, that's a huge move and a bad move for Ukraine. And a little Russia's win in terms of Ukrainian policy. So, I don't think that's a...
I agree with you on that. I agree with you on that. And I actually spoke about it a year ago still. I think it was on the Voice of America when it was still working. That, I mean, first of all, I think by Ukrainian law, you can have elections during the martial law. So you would have to basically change your constitution and your law. And then, of course, in that kind of combat situation, when the war is on the territory on Ukraine with this huge front line, how do the soldiers technically vote, for example, on the front line, the ones who are right now in combat with the Russian army? Well, I agree with you, it would be extremely difficult to implement.
But at the same time, American president also repeating that narratives almost as long as he took the Oval Office, right? So, yeah, and Peter, it was a very long and complicated year for Kyiv and Washington diplomacy. It was mixed signals and public disagreements and tense moment. How would you describe and sum up this U.S.-Ukraine diplomacy in 2025?
Well, I think a lot of things has really changed. And with the current American administration, it is, of course, very difficult to predict what's going to happen next. And that's what they say is the defining trait of the Trump presidency. Even his son has just recently said in one of the interviews that he doesn't know what his father is going to do next. And he thinks that this is a good thing. So he switched several times. You remember the year started with this disastrous meeting in the Oval Office. Then at some point, the president, our president, was saying that Russia is not winning the war. And I actually agree with that. It's not winning the war because in 3 years, they haven't taken a very substantial part of the Ukrainian territory. Forget about big cities. So then there was a more friendly and amicable meeting with European leaders, President Zelenskyy and Trump, or all of them in the White House. I mean, it's changing back and forth. And of course, now with Witkov, who is not a professional diplomat, which is very rare for the United States. I mean, historically, we remember shuttle diplomacy between, say, Brezhnev and Nixon, but the messenger was Kissinger, who was extremely educated professional diplomat. Today, we see a kind of a different situation when the son-in-law and a friend of the president are doing this kind of shuttle diplomacy. What to expect from that, I can't really predict. I think if I were to make a prediction, I would say the war will continue, and this diplomacy is unlikely to achieve the end of the war, because the ball is in the hands of Putin. He doesn't want to end the war.
So how would you describe Witkov and Kushner in terms of their approach to end Russia's war in Ukraine? So they are definitely, as you said, not a diplomat, but do they have just...
Well, it's a very, what you say, sort of a classic, realism. They just don't want to go to war with Russia, right? I mean, they disagree on many issues with Europeans, now also politically and culturally, as we see from the new national security strategy. So they just basically want to, in many respects, to give up to Putin, to say, take whatever you right now want and let's finish there. But But the problem is, if this were to happen, I don't think it will be enough for him. So for Putin, it won't be enough, what they're talking about now.
And many in Ukraine and Europe fear that this flexibility toward Russia could turn into kind of normalization. How dangerous is that, red carpet effect that everybody saw in Alaska, when the other side is a dictator?
Well, I guess at some point, the current administration wanted to do something what Nixon did in China when he extended his hand to China in order to create tension more with the Soviet Union to separate them. So, but it's not going to happen now because like Russia and China are very close to each other. And as we saw more recently, also India became more and more close to Russia. If we watch the recent visit of Putin with Narendra Modi in Delhi, he was received at the highest possible level as not just as an ally, as a very good friend. So yes, I think there are substantial circles in the government today who want normalization with Russia. And I do think it's frightening because you can't really trust Putin. I think it's even worse than with the Soviet Union, much worse, because the Soviet Union had a certain principle, certain agenda, and so forth. But the reality is that in Washington still there is a very large percentage of political figures who do not want normalization with Russia. So the public opinion, I would say, even on the highest political level, is very divided because you'll see someone like Senator Lindsey Graham, who works with Trump, who supports Trump, who is a Republican, and he plays goals with Trump. But at the same time, he is extremely anti-Russian. I mean, in Russia, they call him a terrorist, and he is definitely pro-Ukrainian. So, I think those moods may swing back and forth. We'll see what happens in the next election. Some people expect significant changes in the midterm elections in Congress. So, yes, to answer your question, I mean, it's dangerous, and there is a tendency to normalize the relations with Russia.
And yes, Peter, speaking about that, if we drop the diplomatic language, was this year, 2025, the year the world finally admitted the old order is gone?
Yeah, I agree with it completely. And I actually talk about it a lot. I started talking. Some people already were talking about the deep divisions in the West, beginning even in 2003, 2004, with the invasion of Iraq, for example. There is a very famous German philosopher, Habermas, who was talking already at that time about substantial divisions. But of course, there was nothing like what's happening today, because we see that Europe is criticized in the new national security doctrine, strategy. Russia is not even presented as an adversary. So China is presented as an adversary. So there is a statement to end the war in Ukraine, but not clear how. Then in Europe, within Europe, we see deep divisions now. We see Orban in Hungary, Fico in Slovakia, who basically want to have very working, functioning relations with Russia and don't want to support Ukraine at all. And Meloni is almost going that direction as well. Then you have, we have to be real, in Germany and France, the right-wing politicians who don't support Ukraine are really, really gaining in popularity. I'm talking about Alternative für Deutschland in Germany and the French rally in France. In Germany, the elections, unless something horrible happens, not until 2029. So 4 years is a huge period of time today, very long. But in France, it's 2027. In Hungary, I think it's just in a few months, in April of 26. So yeah, we see the division and potentially new alliances, because definitely there are countries in Europe who are not going to give up on Ukraine. This is Poland, Baltic states, I think Scandinavia, most likely the United Kingdom, because I don't think the party of Nigel Farage has many chances to win. That would, of course, change the landscape of UK too. So yes, we see very much, I would say, the division of the West, what Putin wanted. Like always, he talked about the new security architecture of Europe since the beginning of his presidency. And that's in many respects, it's happening. I mean, there are voices in the United States who want to withdraw from NATO. So yes, we live in a very uncertain world with the security situation, the worst, I think, since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's actually worse now because there are many more players. At that time, it was just the United States and the Soviet Union. And in the end, it could be solved between the two, the General Secretary and the President, what happened with Khrushchev and Kennedy. Today, there are so many more players that it can cause a lot of trouble.
Yes, Peter. And speaking about the security situation in the United States, the new U.S. national security strategy signals a shift, a huge one. How big is it, and what does it tell us about America's real priorities?
So the priorities are focused on America, of course, today. If you read this, the national security strategy, I mean, it's public. You can find it online. It's basically immigration, the southern border. China is seen much more as an adversary than Russia. Russia is actually not even seen as an adversary. There is the language in the security strategy which talks about European cultural decline, European civilizational closure. So there is really unhappiness, a political unhappiness with more of a left-wing progressive parties in Europe. So yes, this is a very, very big change. But again, I would repeat, today, which is another change, I would say, in international politics, so much depends on politicians. We basically come back to this idea of like big men in our history, very significant individuals. Because today, like, of course, this is so much from Donald Trump and his policies. So we don't know who's going to be the next president. There is no really a grand strategy. Say, if you look at the history of the Cold War, some of the Democrats were more war hawkish on the Soviet Union than some Republicans. For example, Jimmy Carter, with his national security advisor, was from Poland, Zbigniew Brzezinski, were probably more anti-Soviet than Nixon. So there was a continuity. There was clear. It was clear who was an adversary, who was a number one adversary. Today, it can change with a new president. I mean, there is no that what you would call a grand strategy in where the European Union, between different European countries and the United States of America. So this impracticability makes the world very frightening and scary. And then, as I said, again, you have like different places. Like, for example, Turkey is an extremely important country today. They've changed completely the geopolitics of the Caucasus after the for Azerbaijan, helping Azerbaijan. So India is a very important independent player. So yes, the world is completely different. And the priorities of the United States today are to focus primarily on the United States. It's like a return, you know, they even brought back the Monroe Doctrine, the doctrine from the 19th century, which said that the United States should focus primarily on the Western Hemisphere as its sphere of geopolitical interest. And the war in Ukraine and European issues are more the business of Europeans. And which, of course, is going to boost like economies like country like Germany, for example, is talking today about being militarized. So the changes are global.
Global, right. Peter, you named such names as Orban and Fico. So since 2020, who are openly supporting Russian dictator. And since 2022, some of the leaders, I would say even many leaders, avoided Moscow. No parades, no photos, no handshakes. And now the mood seems to be changing. Why? What changed fear, interest, fatigue in 2025?
Well, I wouldn't overstate it. Still, if you look, who actually looked it up, who attended the 225 parade, which is, of course, was big because it's a date, it was the 80th anniversary. So from Europe, it was only Vucic from Serbia and Fico from Slovakia who attended. So if you look at the countries, yeah, it was Xi Jinping, it was Brazil's Lula, Egypt's Sisa, and there were, of course, like leaders from the Soviet Union, from the countries like Belarus, Armenia, like Central Asian nations. But for example, very interesting, Aliyev refused to come the very last minute. And this becomes an extremely powerful and important country in the former Soviet space, supported by Turkey. So I would not overstate the case. I mean, for Europe, you're talking just about Serbia and Slovakia. China, like, has been a good friend and partner of Russia now for many years. So, like, I'm not that pessimistic on that front. Like, of course, Moscow tried to sell it that there are so many leaders there. Yes, there were quite a few, but even I think the South African leaders who were allegedly very neutral on this war and sometimes even expressing some understanding for Russia, I don't think they came for the celebration. And of course, Russia is not invited anywhere in Europe. Like the Soviet soldiers were the one who liberated Auschwitz, and they were, before the war, there was someone from Russia was always invited on the highest level. Now they are not invited, and Putin used to like attend. Before 2014, he was D-Day in France and so forth. He was included. American presidents, a couple American presidents came and participated in 9th of May parade on the Red Square. So none of that is coming back. So I would not worry that much about it. But yes, those countries who want normalization, it's because of, I guess, business and general like anti-Western sentiments from the global South.
Peter, you said that there are a lot of individual players in the world, not like it was like 60 years ago. Do you see new global alliances forming right now? Who is moving closer, and what does that mean for Ukraine, for the West?
So when I talked about individuals, I also spoke about this very interesting new tendency. Like there is an individual like Elon Musk, who is now like a state within a state. So he alone could probably, if he wanted to wage a war, because he has enough money to do that or support some country in a war. He was directly involved with the White House in the war in Ukraine because of Starlink. So when the individual is so powerful, I mean, we spoke before about it. There is this theory of like new medievalism coming back today, that basically it's like there's a Holy Roman Empire and the popes, it's like in the Middle Ages or later. So today we get corporations and individuals who are as powerful as nation states, or some of them are more powerful than nation states. The alliances, as I said, I see in Europe, some countries, as I said, will not give up on Ukraine. So there may be more bilateral relations between, say, Poland and Ukraine, Baltic states and Ukraine, Scandinavian countries and Ukraine. I'm more worried about France and Germany because what's happening, Macron is extremely supportive of Ukraine today, but we don't know what's going to happen in France in 2027. If the right wing wins, and it's Le Pen's party now, there's another leader, a very young man, Bardella, very charismatic, it may completely change. All the aid may stop. So Europe could be divided. Germany so far seems to be pretty solid for the next 4 years. But yes, you could see these alliances in Europe forming like outside of NATO. Like, for example, President Zelenskyy was just in Canada. Canada has a very historically rich Ukrainian community. I'm saying rich is big in a sense, like with rich history. So Canada is not going to give up. They're going to help. So that's what needs to be worked out, I think. I would look, if I was in the Ukrainian government, I would try to look more carefully in potential relations with South Korea and Japan, because they definitely don't have good relations with Russia, and Japan until today doesn't even have a peace treaty.
Right. Now, as far as I know, Ukrainian diplomats are working very closely with South Korea and Japan, and I think our connection will be closer eventually. Peter, you've studied empires. Is Russia still trying to win this war against Ukraine, or simply trying not to collapse?
So it's interesting you ask me that, because there was this famous French German journalist who, like after the annexation of Crimea, he said he was trying to express kind of understanding for Russia. And he says, you understand, without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be like a European country. It becomes exclusively an Asian empire. Not that they claim that they're Europe today. They don't want to be. They believe that they're unique, whatever, according to their Eurasianist ideology. But I do think it's both. So on the one hand, they realize that without Ukraine, they're losing so much in terms of their like imperial identity, because that's like Kyiv or Mykolaiv or Odessa. That's all what they consider historic Russia. That's why I think Putin will never be happy just with Donbass. Then they want Belarus, I think, too. So it's a mutual process. On the one hand, they don't want to lose their empire, but on the other hand, they want to bring back the smaller version of the Russian Empire. It's Malorussia, Novorossiya, and Belarus. So they definitely don't want an addition. There is no fear that they would go to war, say, with Central Asian states or Azerbaijan, because I think they're very bigoted in terms of their religious beliefs. They don't want any Muslims, more Muslims as part of their country. So part of the Ukrainian project is also very racist, because they want more white, what they consider white people, to produce more babies for the Russian Empire, because the demographics are so bad. So it's both solving the demographic issue, it's restoring what they see as the historic Russian Empire, and it's saving it, yes, through force from potential disintegration. So it's definitely an imperial project, and I don't think they're hiding it anymore. They're saying it pretty openly.
Right. Peter, people keep saying Russia's economy is holding on. People and analysts, but holding on to what and for how long? I know you're not an economical expert, but right. What is your take on that?
Well, I can tell you, I actually taught economy, but from international political economy, from a very sort of anthropological, ideological point of view. I actually believe that ideology plays an extremely important role in economic. Some Western economists think, like, for example, Friedman, it's all just pure economics determining everything. I think it's not true, because you look at the country like North Korea, Putin once said that even if they eat grass, they won't give up on their nuclear program. So Russia, to some degree, like I would say, if you produce enough like nationalist fever, which the propaganda and the government is pretty successful in accomplishing that in Russia, people still will support the war. And I think as long as it doesn't go directly to their houses, but it doesn't, because they still don't conscript too many people. And there are tons of people, as you know, who willingly go and sign the contracts with the Russian army. I think in the year of 2024, there was over 400,000 people who went and joined the Russian army just to go fight in Ukraine for money. So their economy I mean, they're surviving. I, of course, can't go there anymore, and I haven't been there in like years now. But it seems to me that they're not dying. They're definitely not like North Korea. I mean, for the majority of Russian, it's still not a wealthy life, but we don't see any major protests, or we don't see like any major uprisings. So it can last, I think, for quite a long time. And they basically militarize their entire economy, and they are still pretty successful in selling their natural resources to India, to China, and unfortunately and shamefully, indirectly to European countries via India and China.
Which European countries?
Well, the UK, I think many of them still get, by different indirect routes, they get Russian oil and gas.
Yes.
I mean, they sell crude to India, then India sells it via third partners. So European countries definitely, not just Hungary. Hungary, of course, does it openly. They want to do it. That's their main motive. But even countries who support Ukraine, they still, I don't have exact data in front of me, which countries and what are the amounts, but still those deals still go on.
Right. And Ukraine's strike on Russian oil infrastructure used to sound impossible for us a year ago, for example. Now it's happening. Is this a real breakthrough the moment Russia's safe rare stopped being safe?
So far, to me, it doesn't seem. Yes, I clearly see it as a good thing to happen, and of course, Ukraine should continue doing that. But I don't see so far the damage substantial enough for the people to revolt. So if there will be like no gas and gas station, I heard it can happen in several places. Yeah, maybe it will bring some results, but I still don't see the damage so far which could change the situation in the war. And you know, Putin, when he's pushed in the corner, he could just, I mean, like every time you do something towards Russia, the response is 5 times worse. And it's especially targeted in the Russian case. The Russians are targeting civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. So I'm not very optimistic in this sense.
But what about, I mean, real poverty among soldiers and regions and families? Ever that stop a dictator, dictator Putin?
But you see what he does. He actually, who goes and signs the contracts with the Russian army? This is exactly very poor people. So imagine if you live in a small Siberian town or in Buryatia and your monthly salary, I don't remember what rubles are worth now, but something an equivalent of $300 a month, say $300-400 a month. And out of a blue, you get like some regions paying equivalent is like 1 million rubles and more. It's like $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 for just signing the contract. Then you get untaxed $2,000 to $4,000 like every month for fighting the war. So you leave your wife basically and the family with this money because those soldiers don't need money at the front line. So when you get killed, the family gets over an equivalent of over $100,000. So it's a war economy. It's just basically like a mercenary army. You would think, actually, I think Neil Ferguson a while ago called the Russian war a classic colonial war with a colonial army, because there are so many non-ethnic Russians who are fighting at this war. And you know, Buryat, Tatar, so the people from the Northern Caucasus, and these are usually people who clearly go for pure economic reasons. So it's an opposite result. As long as they have cash and they're printing cash to give to these families, people are signing the contracts. So they're actually taking the poorest of the poor from Russia to go fight. And the rich stay home, and this is the horrible reality, and they support this war in their propaganda barrages and speeches and all of that.
So is Russia as an empire at the peak of its aggression or already in a slow decline?
I can't say that. We can see like an escalation. You see what's scary, because if it's some people actually say that if say Putin dies tomorrow, like of a heart attack, it can get worse before it gets better before, because there are war hawks around him who think that he's not doing enough. I generally, as you know, and I wrote about it and published, and spoken to you in other venues about it, I don't think that Russia will survive in that regime for more than, say, 20 or something, 25 years. Even as much as the Soviet Union was powerful ideologically in terms of controlling like half of the world, basically, half of Europe, it still existed for 70 odd years. So I don't think one can replicate Putin. So as I said, I think I'll be able to visit Russia one day. It will be a different political system. I think Karamurza believes the same thing. I agree with him. We will go back one day to visit at least. But when it's going to happen is very difficult to predict. And I say I would give it 2-3 decades, but I would say that it can get worse, because if Putin feels he is the type of a man that there is like any unrest, any unhappiness, it's going to be a brutal, brutal suppression of anything. Already the country became worse than the late Soviet Union, definitely much worse. Say in the early 1980s, late 1970s, in order to go to prison for a political crime, you needed to do something very serious, like to write like a 300-page book about something, about Leninism, how horrible it was, about some like really do something seriously anti-Soviet. Today, you know, like these people, what they go to prison for nothing, for like joke, for a post on social media, for telling the truth about what the Russian army does in Ukraine with the civilian population and so forth. So like I'm not hopeful. It's going to get worse and worse in a short term.
When you're saying that you're going to come back to Russia in decades, I'm thinking, Peter, do you believe in rebirth? Because I think...
No, you know, it was a famous thing. Think about 1970, whatever, like early 1970s, when Solzhenitsyn, not like I'm a huge fan of him, and we discussed it, he was imperialist. But he said, when he came to the West, he said that I'll be back. And like everyone was laughing at him. He said, the man is crazy. I do think that the changes, I lived through the fall of the Soviet Union, and I was a young man. I could never imagine, I'll tell you, even in 1986 or 87, when perestroika started, and there was more freedom in terms of like a freedom of speech, expression, none of us could predict at that time that it's just in a matter of time, the entire country would fall apart. So I think it can happen fast. One thing I'll tell you, and that's I'm absolutely convinced, Russia is not going to be destroyed from outside. It has to be that political system needs to be destroyed from inside. Look at the 500 years of Russian history. Of course, it's not 1,000, how they claim they want to steal Kyiv and Rus and pretend that that's their beginning. So like if you begin it properly with Ivan III or Ivan IV, there were only 3 periods when Russia faced basically a major political change, potentially disintegration. It was the times of troubles in the beginning, in early 60s, hundreds with Boris Godunov, when the Poles came to Moscow, so forth. Then it was the October Revolution, first the February Revolution, of course, when Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne and the Russian Empire fell apart, when Ukraine became an independent state. And then finally, with Gorbachev and perestroika, so it always pretty much came from inside, from the top. So what one can do, one, of course, try to facilitate it, what the United States and Europe and like the Russian dissidents did in the Soviet times. So that work needs to be done, but it has to come from inside. And I think it will happen. At some point, people will get sick. And I don't think it will be what you said from very poor people. It's more likely to happen from the elites, when the elites will think that it's more beneficial for them not to be in this imperial bubble and isolation. But it needs to be somehow miraculously a new generation of people who can do that. That's my take. I don't know, maybe I sound too optimistic.
Well, we'll see. And China is often called a new kind of empire. Is it repeating old imperial mistakes or learning from them?
Well, it's a very different empire. I think they're much, much smarter than Russia, because China, of course, has a very booming economy. They have a humongous population. They have more freedom of speech than in Russia. They also still maintain working relations with the United States of America, and they have very good relations. I mean, pretty good relations with Europe, with the European Union and separate European countries. They definitely don't want to get into like any kind of fight with China. So I think it's behaving very smartly. They're looking at Russia as an example what not to do. And I will give you one prediction. I do not think that in the nearest future they will invade Taiwan, because they don't want to see what's happening, say, with Ukraine. They're watching this war very carefully. Another big delusion about Russia, they do not consider Russia like a friend. And if any, like Russia is getting more and more 100% dependent on China. The country which could stop the war of Russia with Ukraine is probably China. If it completely cut off all business with Russia. For whatever variety of reasons they don't want to do it. It would need to be actually both China and India. But China, yes, it is an empire. I mean, they of course have, they produce this narrative that they were colonized and abused by European empires. To some degree, yes, but at the same time, China is arguably the longest continuous civilization on Earth. They're like civilization with writings, monumental architecture, state structures, starts like over 5,000 years or more ago, depending on your definition of those things. And they're looking very carefully, and they colonized, Central Asia, Chinese Central Asia, Xinjiang. There are like, I think 11 or 12 million Uyghur people who go through this re-education camps. There are people in the Tibet who would like to be, I'm sure many of those nationalities would like to be independent, but they're more careful. They don't want to lose their connections. I think neither with the United States nor with the European Union. They're expanding their imperial power very smartly, both in Africa, South America. Like, for example, think about it. It's a communist country, but they don't set up institutes of Marxism, Leninism, say in the United States or in Brazil. There's a Confucius institutes, because they know no one cares today about Marxism, Leninism, and it's not attractive. So they're choosing everything from their history to make their history attractive. It's a very intricate and much smarter way to do this. So I think they're looking at Russia and learning on Russia's mistakes and crimes, of course.
Peter, and finally, looking into the next year, what is the biggest illusion the West still has about this war, and what is Russia's biggest illusion about Ukraine?
I'll tell you two major things. So the West is delusion, which I face all the time, that somehow the Russian people don't support Putin. That, yes, I always say there is some, maybe million people, like, okay, 2 million, say 5 million, say 1 million lived outside of Russia, say another 3 million hate them but afraid of doing anything, they don't want to go to prison. But still, it's a country of 150 million. So those feelings can change. But right now, there is a very substantial part of population which actually support Putin. That's what many people don't realize. They also, many people which I see here working, I don't work directly with the Russian opposition, I just watch them. But the institutes who fund them and work with them, they also think that they somehow stand a chance and represent a substantial population of Russia, what you call the other Russia. I think we've discussed that with you before. They're almost not really other Russia. which is substantial. There is like really not such thing today, I think. It's a very, very little percentage of population, and they're fighting with each other ferociously. So the delusion from Russia is continuing that they can actually achieve everything by military, as you said in the beginning of our conversation, that Putin is threatening to achieve all these goals militarily if he can get them diplomatically, basically if he can get Ukraine surrender. So what they miscalculated from the beginning of the war, and the West too, that Ukrainians won't fight because they were looking at the case of Crimea in 2014. So now the propaganda, Russian propaganda, said that there are so many Ukrainians deserting the army, but it's still somehow miraculously, it's like hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are fighting at the battlefield. There are women also fighting there. So the delusion on the Russian side, as they, in the Russian propaganda, they never even called the Ukrainian army, very rarely. They say Ukrainian Nazis, militants, nationalists. So it's basically taking away all the agency from the Ukrainian people, which becomes stronger and stronger because every year of war, like every more 10, 20,000 casualties only add the strength to the Ukrainian society. So that's what they don't understand, that there is a civil society in Ukraine, that there is actually a very strong society, and also they don't understand the delusion, which is ridiculous. That Putin repeated, we need to pretend the Russian speakers. For God's sake, every president of Ukraine, I believe, except for Yushchenko, was raised with the Russian language as their first language. They're not Russian, they're Ukrainian. So that delusion is still there. If people speak Russian, they are Russian. So these are the key delusions, I think.
Right, and I think no matter how they're going to call Ukrainian army, still Ukrainian armed forces are one of the best in the world right now, and little by little, they're still gaining back the territories occupied by Russia. So
like, I agree with you that actually as an active, at least in Europe, because we haven't seen a major war like that since World War II. And if you think a nuclear power, so if you take it a half glass full or half glass empty, I think is definitely half full. In 3 years again, the territorial gains are actually not that substantial, given the size of Russia.
Given that that was the second army of in the world, yes, it's miserable.
Right. And Ukraine is still resisting and successfully. So, this is a big delusion on their side.
I completely agree with you, Peter.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Peter, I think for now, I'm really appreciating for your answers, but we will have a lot to unpack next year. So let's leave something for 2026. And for now, thank you so much for being with our studio, with the Channel 24 whole this year, and see you next year.
Yeah, and I'll definitely on New Year's Eve, I'll have a drink for Перемога, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!